The signal came in on a Tuesday, I know. It was a Tuesday because I had just finished the worst cup of coffee in the history of the United Earth Expeditionary Corps, which is saying something because we had been making terrible coffee in space for 60 years. I was sitting in the briefing room on Outpost Corvell, reading a damage report from a training exercise that had gone slightly sideways when Lieutenant Nora Vance knocked on the door frame and said, "Commander Okafor, you need to hear this." I set down the report. Nora's voice had a particular quality to it that I had learned to pay attention to over 4 years of working together. It was not panic. Nora did not panic. It was something quieter and more serious than panic. It was the voice she used when something had happened that did not fit into any of the categories we had prepared for. The signal was from the Velhari. I had heard of them. Most people in the Corps had. They were a small species, amphibious, about the height of a 12-year-old human child, and they lived on a cluster of wet green worlds in the middle of what the Galactic Accord called the Outer Passage. They were not politically significant. They did not have large armies or powerful trade networks. They were in the polite language of interstellar diplomacy. Minor species. In less polite language, they were the kind of people that larger species tended not to worry very much about. The signal was a distress call, not a formal request for mediation, not a diplomatic inquiry, a distress call, the kind with the audio feed running underneath the text transmission, so you could hear what was happening in the background while the words scrolled across the screen. I listened to the audio for about 40 seconds before I asked Nora to turn it off. "What is the Accord's official position?" I asked. Nora pulled up the response that had already come through channels. The Accord had classified the situation as a limited territorial engagement between the Velhari and the Kreth Dominion, which was a large militaristic civilization about 30 light-years away that had been expanding slowly and steadily for the past 2 centuries. The Accord's position was that the engagement was being conducted within the accepted framework of interstellar conflict conventions. Both parties had filed the required notice. The Kreth had submitted a formal declaration of territorial claim. The Velhari had submitted a defense of occupancy. The paperwork was all in order. "Paperwork," I said. "Yes, Commander." I looked at the audio feed icon on the screen. I did not press play again. I did not need to. Here is what I knew about the Kreth Dominion that most people in comfortable positions far from the Outer Passage did not fully appreciate. The Kreth were a proud species. They had a strong warrior culture built around the concept of honorable engagement in their system. War was a formal process. There were rules, there were announcements. There were specific times and places for fighting. Civilian populations were, in theory, protected under Kreth military code. In theory. What happened in practice, particularly to populations too small and too isolated to lodge an effective complaint with the Accord, was a different matter. And the Accord's oversight was not what anyone would describe as thorough. "They are asking for observers," Nora said. "That's what the formal request says, a neutral party to witness the engagement and report to the Accord." And the Accord approved it. The Accord approved the observer request. They have not assigned anyone yet. I looked at her, she looked at me. We're technically a neutral party, I said. Technically, she said, we haven't signed the conflict conventions. No, I said. We haven't. This was true. Earth had been in contact with the Galactic Accord for 19 years. We had trade agreements, we had communication protocols, we had an embassy of sorts staffed by a rotation of diplomats who spent most of their time explaining to other species why humans were complicated, what we did not have because our government had spent 19 years arguing about it was a signature on the Accord's conflict conventions, the document that governed how member species were permitted to conduct warfare, intervene in conflicts, and operate in contested zones. We were not bound by it. At the time, the Accord treated this as an administrative inconvenience, a paperwork gap that would eventually be resolved. They did not consider the implications. I filed the observer request that afternoon. I listed our unit as neutral. Human observers attending under humanitarian assessment protocols, which was a description I invented on the spot, and which no one challenged because no one had a framework yet for challenging it. I requisitioned transport. I told my unit to pack for a wet weather deployment. Corporal Owen Fletcher asked if we were bringing weapons. We're observers, I said. He looked at me. Bring the weapons, I said. The Velhari homeworld, the one they called Orith, was 8 days of standard travel from Outpost Corvin. I spent most of those 8 days reading. I read everything I could find about the Kreth Dominion, their military structure, their command traditions, their documented engagements over the past 50 years, their wins, their losses, how they communicated, how they supplied their forces, how they set up forward positions, and most importantly, what they believed about the nature of conflict. The Kreth believed that war was a conversation between warriors, a structured exchange with agreed-upon language. You announced your intentions. You engaged at appointed times. You accepted certain outcomes as final. It was in its way almost elegant. It had kept Kreth warfare from becoming total annihilation for centuries. Their culture had evolved around it. Their entire military identity was built on the idea that a true warrior fought within the form, and that fighting outside the form was not war, but something lesser, something shameful. I made a note of that. I made a lot of notes. Private Callum Drake, who was 22 years old and from a small town in northern England, and who had joined the Corps because he thought space would be interesting, sat across from me in the transport cabin and watched me filling pages of handwritten notes in a small brown book. Are you making a plan? He asked. I'm making observations, I said. You look like you're making a plan. Observers observe, I said. He was quiet for a moment, then, Commander, are we actually just going to watch? I looked up from my notes. Callum had the kind of face that was still carrying some of the softness of youth, but his eyes had already lost it 4 years in. The Corps did that. You learn to look at things directly. We are going to observe, I said very carefully. We arrived at Orithon on morning, low cloud cover, light rain, the air smelling of salt and something floral that I could not identify. The Velhari who met us at the landing point were polite and exhausted in the particular way of people who have been afraid for a long time and have run out of the energy for it to show. Their delegation leader was a small, older individual named Eshin, whose translator rendered their voice into something calm and precise. "You are the human observers," Eshin said. "We are," I said. "The Kreth have already established their forward position. They have announced the first formal engagement for 3 days from now, sunrise, the eastern field." I looked at the eastern field. It was flat, open ground about 2 km wide, perfect for the kind of structured line versus line engagement that Kreth doctrine preferred. "And your people," I asked, "where are they?" Eshin looked at me with large, wet eyes that held something I recognized from a long time ago, from a different world, from a different kind of conflict. It was the look of someone who already knew how the story ended and was simply waiting for it. "We are here," Eshin said quietly. "We are waiting." That night I sat outside the temporary shelter we had set up on the edge of the settlement and looked at the lights across the eastern field. Kreth campfires, ordered, evenly spaced, the kind of fires that announced their position clearly and with confidence, because in Kreth military tradition, concealment of your camp was considered a form of deception unworthy of a warrior. Owen sat down next to me. He was quiet for a while. "What are we going to do?" he asked. I had been asking myself the same question since the transport. I had listened to the audio feed for 40 seconds, and in those 40 seconds I had heard enough to know exactly what was happening here and exactly what would happen if we simply observed it. The Accord's mediated outcome for this kind of limited engagement was a territorial adjustment. The Velhari would cede some portion of their land. The Kreth would formally accept it. Both parties would file the appropriate documentation. The Accord would record it as a resolved dispute, and the Velhari who lived on that land and on the land adjacent to it, and in the settlements that depended on it, would have whatever future the Kreth decided to permit them. 400,000 people, that was the population number in the Accord's own file. I picked up the radio. I called back to the Corps relay station. "This is Commander Akefer at Orith. I need battalion-level deployment. Authorization, full unit. Non-observational configuration." There was a pause on the other end. "Commander, your listed mission is observer status." "I am amending the mission." Another pause. "Then on what grounds?" I thought about Eshin's eyes. I thought about the audio feed. I thought about 400,000 people waiting in the dark. "Humanitarian grounds," I said. "Send the battalion, all of it." There was a longer pause this time. Then the relay officer said carefully, "Commander, the Accord representative on station has already flagged your presence and is requesting clarification of your unit's mandate. Tell them we are clarifying it ourselves." I said. Akefer out. Owen was watching me. "Now we have a plan?" he asked. "Now," I said, "we have a plan." I spent the rest of the night at the table in our shelter with a map of the eastern field and everything I had written in my small brown book. Over 8 days of travel, Nora sat across from me. Callum made more of the terrible coffee. Outside, the Kreth fires burned in their neat, ordered rows, and somewhere across the field their war speaker was no doubt preparing his formal declaration for 3 days from now, confident in the structure of the engagement, confident in the conventions that governed it, confident that whatever came next would follow the form He was not wrong to feel confident, not yet. But in the morning the Accords representative, a tall, thin creature from a species called the Vithrone, arrived at our shelter and stood in the doorway with the particular stiffness of someone who expected to be obeyed. "Commander HFY," it said through its translator, "your unit is registered as observers. You have no sanctioned combat mandate under Accord Convention." I looked up from my map. "I know," I said. "Then you understand that any action beyond observation is a violation of your registered status." "I understand that you believe that," I said. The Vithrone representative was quiet. "For a moment, you are bound by the Accord's framework as a registered participant in this observation." "We are registered as observers," I said. "That is accurate, but observer status under Accord protocol does not require signatories to the conflict conventions. We signed the observer agreement. We did not sign the conventions." I turned back to the map. "Which means the conventions do not apply to us." I heard the representative draw in a breath. "You cannot simply decide the conventions do not apply." "I did not decide that," I said. "Your legal framework decided it 19 years ago, when it allowed non-signatory species to file for observer status without requiring convention compliance. I did not write that rule. I am simply the first person to notice it out loud." The representative stood there for another moment. Then it said in a voice that had gone very flat, "You are making a serious mistake." "Perhaps," I said, "but it is our mistake to make. We never agreed to make yours." It left without another word. Nara watched the door, then looked at me. "So we're doing this," she said. "We are doing this," I said. She nodded once slowly, the way she always nodded when she had already calculated the odds and decided the odds were not the relevant consideration. Then she picked up her own map and said, "Then let's talk about the northern ridgeline." I smiled. We got to work. When people ask me what the first day of the Orith engagement felt like, I tell them it felt like finally speaking a language I had been thinking in my entire life. I had grown up on Earth in Lagos, where my grandmother used to say that every problem was a locked room and patience was the key. But patience, she also said, only worked if you were the one who decided when to open the door. The Kreth had never met anyone who thought about doors that way. They were about to. The Kreth military was impressive by almost any standard in this part of the galaxy. They were large physically, powerful, disciplined, and experienced. Their units moved with precision. Their commanders communicated through layered system of signal flags and low-frequency tones that allowed near silent coordination across significant distances. They had fought by the Accord's records 37 formally declared engagements in the past century and won 34 of them. The 3 they had not won had ended in negotiated settlements that gave them most of what they wanted anyway. They knew how to fight, there was no question about that. What they did not know was how to fight us. The formal engagement was scheduled for 3 days from our arrival, sunrise. Eastern Field. We had 72 hours and a battalion that had been training for exactly this kind of situation, even if none of us had called it that until now. The first thing I did was send Nora with a small team to the northern ridgeline at 2:00 in the morning on the first night, not to fight, Not yet. Just to walk the ground quietly and place a few survey markers in positions. That the Kreth camp lit up like a formal declaration of presence would have no reason to look for. The second thing I did was talk to Eshin. Eshin met me in a small room at the center of the main settlement, a low building with walls made of something that looked like compressed clay and smelled like rain. There were perhaps a dozen other Velhari in the room, older individuals mostly. The kind of gathering you saw when a community had run out of people who were not exhausted. I asked Eshin to tell me everything they knew about the Kreth force on the eastern field, numbers, equipment, rotation schedules, supply lines, where the food came from, where the water came from, how far back their secondary position was. Eshin told me. They told me in precise, careful detail, in the manner of someone who had been watching their danger for a long time and had memorized its shape. You have been watching them, I said. We have nowhere else to look, Eshin said. I wrote everything down, then I asked a question that made Eshin pause. Where do they feel safe? I asked. The translator rendered a small hesitation before it turned Eshin's response into words. They feel safe in their camp. It is well lit, it is well ordered, their sentries know the watch schedule and the signal patterns. No enemy has ever approached a Kreth camp at night, because night approach is considered dishonorable under their military code. I know, I said. How far is the camp from their supply line? Eshin looked at the map I had unfolded. Between us, 4 km, there is a narrow path through the grove to the southwest. Is it patrolled? Lightly. It is a supply path, not a forward position. I made a note. Owen Fletcher had been sitting in the corner of the room, being very still, in the way that young soldiers learn to be still when their commanders are working through something. When we stepped outside, he fell into step beside me. We're going after the supply line, he said. We are going to observe the supply line, I said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Is that what we're calling it? That is exactly what we are calling it, I said. And if anyone from the Accord asks, you heard me say it. He grinned. It was a good grin, young, a little uncertain but real. You know, back home my dad always said that the most dangerous person in any argument isn't the loudest one. It's the one who already knows how it ends. I stopped walking for a moment and looked at him. He was 22 years old and from a small town, and he had said something that was more or less exactly right. Your dad sounds smart, I said. He's a plumber, Owen said, but yeah. The first night, we did nothing visible. We moved in small teams through the darkness, along the edges of the grove, through the low ground west of the field, learning the terrain the way you learn a room in the dark, by touch and patience. The Kreth sentries did not see us, because we were not where they were looking. They looked outward toward the Velhari settlement, because that was where an enemy was supposed to come from. We came from the other direction. No engagement, no confrontation. We mapped their positions, their sight lines, their timing. We learned where the gaps were. We went back before first light and slept in shifts, and the ones who were not sleeping were studying the maps. The second day, the Accord representative came back, this time with a written notice formally transmitted through the Accord's communication system, advising our unit that our activities as Observers were being monitored, and that any action inconsistent with observer status would result in an immediate, formal complaint to the United Earth Government. I read the notice. I filed it in the back of my small brown book. Then I went and found Sergeant Dale Hooper, who was our unit's best navigator and who had spent his entire career finding routes through terrain that other people had declared impassable. Dale, I said, the Western Grove can. We move a full team through it at night, without visible light. Dale looked at his own map for about 30 seconds. Yes, he said, if we go in 2 lines and the rear team keeps one hand on the shoulder of the person in front. How long? 40 minutes, give or take. Good. He paused. Commander, the supply convoy runs at what time? 3:00 in the morning, I said. Second night running. He nodded slowly, and we would be in position by 2:30, I said. He looked at me with the particular expression of a man who had done this job long enough to know exactly what was being planned and was simply waiting for permission to feel good about it. So, we're not just observing anymore. We are making a very close observation, I said, of what happens when a supply convoy encounters an unexpected road obstruction. Dale smiled. It was the smile of a man who loved his work. The third night, 2 nights before the formal engagement was scheduled to begin, we moved into the Western Grove. At midnight, 14 of us, no lights, one hand on the shoulder of the person ahead, Dale leading, quiet as anything. Through the dark between the trees, we reached the supply path at 2:27. At 3:00 in the morning, a Kreth supply convoy of 4 vehicles came down the path carrying food, water, and equipment. Resupply for the forward camp. They moved slowly because the path was narrow and they did not expect trouble, because supply paths were logistical infrastructure, not military targets, and no enemy in 34 Kreth victories had ever targeted their logistics. We did not destroy the convoy. We did not harm anyone in it. What we did was far simpler, and as it turned out, far more effective. We moved the supply vehicles off the path, removed their fuel elements, and left them parked neatly in the grove, completely intact, with a small written note attached to the lead vehicle. The note was written in Kreth script, which Private Amara Collins had spent 18 months learning in her spare time, because she found languages interesting. It said, "Your supplies are safe. We moved them. Consider this a question about whether your conventions still apply." Then we went back through the grove in the dark and slept. In the morning, the Accord representative arrived at our shelter. Before breakfast, the expression on its face was a kind which I had not seen before from that species, but which translated clearly enough across the species barrier. It was the face of someone who was beginning to understand that the situation they were managing was no longer the situation they had arrived to manage. The Kreth war speaker is demanding an explanation, it said. Of what? I asked. Of what happened to their supply convoy. Their supply convoy is undamaged in the Western Grove, I said. We can provide the exact coordinates. That is not the point, Commander. What is the point? There was a pause, then very carefully. The point is that you have interfered in a formally declared engagement without sanctioned authorization. I looked at the representative for a long moment. We moved some vehicles, I said. We left a note. Is that Prohibited under the observer. Agreement. The representative did not answer, because the observer agreement did not explicitly cover the moving of enemy supply vehicles or the leaving of. Philosophical notes. It had not been written with the assumption that an observer would do either of these things. I am going to be very clear, the representative said. If you continue in this manner, the Accord will file a formal complaint with your government. Your mission will be terminated. I understand, I said. Then you will stand down. I understand what you are saying, I clarified. That is not the same as agreeing with it. The representative left. Nara poured 2 cups of the terrible coffee and handed one to me. How long do you think before they escalate? She asked. 3 days, I said. Maybe 4. Accord moves slowly. Committees have to meet, votes have to happen, paperwork. Nara looked at her cup, and the formal engagement is in 2 days. Yes, I said. So by the time they escalate, it will already be over. That is the general idea, I said. She drank her coffee. What are we doing tonight? I picked up my small brown book. Tonight, I said, we are going to observe the Kreth forward command position from the northern ridgeline. And while we are observing, we are going to count their communication equipment, map their flag signal positions, and figure out which of their signal patterns corresponds to withdraw order. Nora was quiet for a moment, then she said, so you can replicate it. Observers, I said. Observe. She drank the rest of her terrible coffee, then she stood up, rolled out the map, and put her finger on the northern ridgeline. There's a sight line from this point here that covers the entire forward position. If we're there before first light, we have 4 hours of observation before their morning rotation. I looked at the point she was indicating. She was right, as she usually was. Good, I said. Tell Dale we leave at midnight. What happened over the next 48 hours is the part that the Accord sealed records spend the most pages trying to explain, and the part that I can describe most simply. The Kreth War. Speaker had planned a beautiful, formal engagement, 2 forces facing each other across a flat field in the gray light of morning, conducting the kind of structured conflict that had defined Kreth warfare for generations. It was, by their standards, a work of military art. We did not let it happen. We did not fight on the field because the field was where they wanted us. We were not where they wanted us. We were behind them, beside them, above them, on the ridgeline, in the grove to the west, in the low ground to the south that their maps had marked as impassable wetland, which it was technically if you were not willing to spend 8 hours wet to the knee. We were willing. At the exact moment that the Kreth War Speaker walked to the center of the eastern field to formally open the engagement, our signal team on the northern ridgeline broadcast the Kreth withdrawal pattern, the one we had spent 2 nights observing and 40 minutes replicating. It went out on the exact frequency, in the exact pattern, with the exact timing. 3 Kreth forward units began to fall back before their commanders could override it. In the 30 seconds that followed, the Velhari defense, which had been braced for a frontal engagement and had, following my conversation with Eshin, quietly repositioned overnight, moved into the gaps. Nobody was harmed. That is important. This was not a slaughter. It was a Disruption, precise and deliberate, designed to produce one specific outcome. The engagement fell apart. The Kreth War speaker stood on the field and watched his formations, which had been ordered and prepared in confident 30 minutes ago, now standing in the wrong places, responding to conflicting signals, and the look on his face was one that I recognized from my reading. It was the look of a commander whose understanding of the situation had just become obsolete. He called a halt. It was the only decision available to him. And that was when the Accord representative's communication came through, and through the representative, 17 species watching the broadcast feed from their observation ships overhead saw not a battle, but something they had no category for, a conflict that had been taken apart at the joints, not defeated, disassembled. The Accord representative's message was short. Commander Akefer, you have violated the spirit of every convention governing civilized interstellar warfare. I thought about Eshen's eyes. I thought about the audio feed. I thought about 400,000 people. I sent one message back. Name one convention we agreed to. I'll wait. They had no answer, not because they were not smart, not because they were not looking, but because the answer was the same one I had found on the first day in the briefing room, drinking terrible coffee on a Tuesday. We had never signed, and that changed everything. What no one tells you about a long campaign is that the moments between the action are where most of the real work happens. It was 11 days after the Eastern Field engagement, and I was sitting in a temporary shelter with a map that had been redrawn 4 times and a cup of something warm that Amara had made from local Velhari plants, which tasted roughly like tea made by someone who had only been told about tea and had never actually seen any. I drank it anyway. Corporal Owen Fletcher sat across from me, holding his own cup with both hands, looking at the fire element in the center of the shelter with the particular quiet of someone who was working something out. Commander, he said, go ahead. He was quiet for another few seconds. Are we the good guys? I looked at him. He was not being casual. He was asking the way young people ask important questions when they have been carrying them for a while and finally run out of reasons not to speak. I did not answer right away. I thought about the question carefully, which is what it deserved. It would have been easy to say yes, easy and quick, and it would have closed the conversation in a way that left everyone comfortable. But Owen had asked it in earnest, and earnest questions deserve real answers. What made you ask? I said. He turned his cup slowly. I keep thinking about what the Accord representative said about the spirit of the conventions, and I keep thinking, are the conventions wrong, or are we wrong for ignoring them? That is 2 different questions, I said, and they both matter. He nodded. The conventions, I said, were written by species that had already made war into something manageable, something with edges. They look at conflict and they see a process that can be controlled, and they built rules to control it, and the rules work more or less when everyone follows them and everyone has roughly equal power. The rules protect the strong parties from each other. Owen was listening. They protect the weak parties from nothing. I said, not really, a Velhari objection filed with the Accord mediation committee takes 8 months. 8 months is a long time when someone is taking your land. He nodded again, slower. So the conventions are wrong, he asked. The conventions are incomplete, I said. They handle the middle of the problem and ignore the edges, and the edges are where the Velhari live. He thought about this, outside the rain that had been threatening all morning. Finally arrived, soft and even, pattering on the roof. And us, he said, are we wrong for what we're doing? This was the real question. I knew it. And he knew it. I don't know, I said, which was the true answer. I know that we have not done anything irreversible. I know that nobody has been seriously hurt. I know that the Kreth supply convoy is sitting in the Western Grove intact, waiting to be claimed. I know that the engagement on the Eastern field did not produce the outcome the Kreth intended. I paused. I know that this morning Essen told me that 4 settlements in the southern lowlands are still occupied, still there because we bought time. Owen looked up. We didn't save anyone, I said, yet. We disrupted a timetable. We created uncertainty. We made the Kreth pause. And in the space of that pause, people are still in their homes. I set down my cup. Is that being the good guys? I don't know, Owen, I know. It's being the effective ones, and right now effectiveness is what those 4 settlements need. He was quiet for a long moment. The rain came down steady and soft. My mom always said, he said slowly, that the difference between a good person and a useful person is that a good person feels bad about necessary things, and a useful person does the necessary things anyway and feels bad later. I looked at him. He was 22 years old and, sometimes without warning, he said things that were exactly right. Your mom sounds smart, I said. She teaches primary school, he said. But yeah. I picked up the redrawn map. Sergeant Dale Hooper came through the door, shaking rain off his jacket. He dropped into a seat, looked at the map, and said, the second supply route is active. They shifted it east after we moved the first convoy. I know, I said. You already have a plan. I always have a plan. Dale looked at Owen. Has she always been like this? I don't know, Owen said. I've only known her 4 years. She has always been like this, Nora said from the corner without looking up from her own work. I allowed myself a small smile, which was my version of laughing, and picked up my pen. Here is what the Accord sealed records do not mention, because the records were written to describe military events, and this was not precisely a military event. Over the 11 days following the Eastern field disruption, we conducted 14 separate operations. None of them were direct confrontations. All of them were what my notes called structural interventions, which was the phrase I used because it was accurate and because it sounded less alarming than what we were actually doing. We were taking apart the Kreth operation, one piece at a time, not with force, with information, positioning, and the particular brand of stubbornness that I had observed in human beings my entire life. The stubbornness that comes from being a species that once, on a single planet, invented 100 different ways to solve the same problem and could not agree on which one was correct, so eventually just tried all of them. On the 4th day, we identified that the Kreth forward camp rotated its command staff every 6 days. 6 days was a gap in communication continuity. We filed a formal observer's report with the Accord on day 5, a detailed Document describing the specific. Communication gap in neutral. Bureaucratic language. The accord was required by its own rules to forward. Observer reports to both parties. The Creth received a document describing their own vulnerability in their own command rotation, written by people who were supposedly neutral and had to spend 48 hours deciding whether it was an intelligence attack disguised as a report. It was. On the 7th day, Amara found that the Creth Dominion's formal engagement notifications, the documents they filed with the accord to announce each phase of the operation, contained a specific clause requiring 7 days' notice before escalation from contested land to inhabited settlement operations, 7 days. And the clock on that clause had been running since the first notification. We had 4 days left. Amara discovered this at 6:00 in the morning over the tea-like beverage and came to me with her notes and a very precise, careful expression on her face. I read her notes twice. "You are certain?" I said. "I am certain," she said. "I read the original Creth filing. The clause is there." I checked the accord convention. The clause is binding. They filed it themselves. They have to wait the full notification period, which means they cannot move on the settlements for 4 more days, I said. Correct. And in 4 days, the battalion that I requested on day 1 should be arriving tomorrow morning, Amira said. I looked at her, she looked at me. Good, I said, good. There are moments in a campaign where the shape of the thing becomes clear, where you can see not just what is happening now, but what is going to happen, the whole arc of it, like a road unrolling in front of you in the dark. This was one of those moments. The 4-day window meant the settlements were safe until the battalion arrived. The battalion arriving meant our options changed completely. The Creth, with their 7-day clause sitting on top of them, could not move before we were ready. They had filed that clause themselves. They had handed us 4 days in their own paperwork. I thought about what I had read on the transport about Creth military tradition, about the importance to them of fighting within the form of conducting war as a structured process with rules and dignity. Their form had a gap in it, and we had walked right through it. Lieutenant Nora Vance, who had brought me the original signal and who had been at my side through all of it, sat across from me that night with the last of her own notes spread out on the table. They're going to push back hard when the battalion arrives, she said. Accord is already signaling a formal response. I've counted 7 preliminary complaint notices in the last 2 days. 7, I said. That means it's working. She gave me the look she reserved for when I was technically correct, and she wished I wasn't. It means they're frightened. Good, I said. Frightened people file paperwork, and while they are filing paperwork, the settlements stand. Nora looked at the map. And after the battalion, what's the objective? The same as it always was, I said. We make the operation untenable, not through destruction, not through a pitched engagement the Creth can frame as a defense of their honor and escalate from. We make it impossible for them to proceed in any way that fits within their framework. I tapped the map. Creth need this to look like a warrior's operation, structured, honorable, part of the form. We are taking the form away from them piece by piece until there is nothing left for them to stand on. Naru was quiet for a moment, then, and if they abandon the form, Then they are not the warriors there. Culture says they are, I said, and every species in this galaxy watching. The Accord broadcast will see it. She looked at me steadily. You thought this out on the transport. I thought some of it on the transport. I said the rest I thought out in the dark in the western grove on the second night when my boots were full of water. And Dale was counting flag patterns and I had a lot of time to think. She smiled. It was small and tired and real. What happens when this is over, she said. The Accord is not going to forget this. No, I said, they are not. They're going to come for us. They are going to try to contain us, I said, which is different. Coming for us implies a fight. Containing us implies fear. I looked at the map, and fear is more useful to us than a fight in the long run. Outside, the rain had stopped. The night was clear and cold and quiet in the particular way of a place that is waiting for something to happen. I thought about Owen's question, are we the good guys? I thought about the 4 settlements, about Essen's exhausted, careful voice, about 40 seconds of an audio feed I had turned off because I did not need to more. I did not have a clean answer to Owen's question. I did not think clean answers existed for questions like that. What I had was a map and a battalion, arriving in the morning and 4 days of borrowed time and the absolute knowledge that when the Accord sent its formal complaint to Earth and when they diplomats began their slow, careful arguing, 400,000 people would still be in their homes. That was not a clean answer, but it was something. It was real. I picked up my pen and started on the plan for tomorrow. The Accord emergency chamber was larger than I expected. I do not know why I expected it to be smaller. Perhaps because the weight of it felt like it should exist in a small room, a tight space somewhere that held its importance close. Instead, it was vast, circular, with tiered seating that curved upward on all sides and 42 separate delegation pods, each with its own translation array and lighting and the particular formal stillness of places where important people go to decide things about people who are not in the room. I was in the room. That was unusual. They had allowed it, I was told, because it was technically required under Accord observer protocol. A registered observer could not be formally reviewed without being given the opportunity to address the chamber. My legal team, 3 very calm Earth diplomats who had flown in overnight, had made sure the request was filed correctly. They had made me stand. There was no seat designated for me. I stood. 42 species looked at me. Some of them I recognized from files. Many of them I had never seen before. They came in more shapes and sizes and colors than I had names for, and the chamber hummed quietly with the sound of 42 translation arrays running at once. The chair of the session was a Vith Rani, named Counselor Oreth, tall and precise, with the manner of someone who had managed difficult situations for a long time and believed firmly in the power of structure to contain them. Oreth opened the session with a summary of the formal complaint, which took 22 minutes and covered 11 specific instances of what the complaint called systematic disruption of a formally declared interstellar engagement and willful exploitation of convention loopholes by a non-signatory party. I listened to all 22 minutes. When Oreth finished, there was a pause, and the chamber was quiet except for the translation arrays. Commander Akefer Orith said, "You have been granted address time. You may speak." I had prepared notes. I had spent 3 evenings on the transport back from Orith writing out what I wanted to say, in careful, logical sequence addressing each of the 11 formal charges with the specific legal and procedural reasoning that my Earth diplomats had helped me construct. It was a good argument. It was precise. It covered everything. I did not use it. I looked at the chamber, 42 species. Some of them ancient, some of them powerful beyond anything Earth had yet achieved, all of them watching me, this human being standing without a chair in the middle of their room. I said, "I have one question." Orith's posture shifted slightly. "You have been given address time to respond to the complaint." "I know," I said. "My question is the response." I looked at the nearest translation array. The Accord's own records document the population of the Velhari southern settlements at the time the Kareth Dominion filed their engagement notice. You have those records. Counselor Orith has those records. Every delegation in this chamber has access to those records. I paused. Under the Accord's mediated outcome, using the standard territorial adjustment formula for a level 3 engagement, how many of those 400,000 people would have remained in their settlements after the formal resolution? Silence. Not the deliberate procedural silence of a chamber waiting for a speaker to continue. A different kind of silence. The kind that happens when a question lands somewhere real. Orith said, "Commander, the mediated outcome is a standard process designed to resolve territorial disputes with minimum escalation, and I know what it is designed for," I said. Quietly, I asked what the number would be. Another silence. A delegation from a species I did not know, smaller than most in the chamber, in the upper left tier, shifted in its seat. A small movement. I noticed it. "The Accord's mediated process," Orith said, "is not the subject of this review. The subject is your unit's conduct." "My unit's conduct," I said, "resulted in the current status of those 4 settlements which, as of this morning, remains occupied by their original population." I let that sit for a moment. Would the Accord like to provide the number that the mediated process would have produced? I am asking genuinely. I would like the chamber to have that number in front of them while they evaluate my conduct. There was a murmur through some of the delegations. The translation arrays hummed. Counselor Orith was quiet for several seconds. Then, with the careful precision of someone who had already checked the records and already knew the answer and had been hoping this question would not be asked, the projected post-mediation population retention for the contested settlements under standard level 3 adjustment was assessed at approximately 30 to 40%. The number went through the chamber like a current. 30 to 40% of 400,000, 120,000 to 160,000 people. That meant between 240,000 and 280,000 people who were under the Accord's orderly, formal, convention-respecting process simply not in the calculation. I did not say anything. I did not need to. The chamber was very quiet. Orith said in a different tone now, "Commander Akefer, the Accord's processes exist to maintain interstellar stability and prevent escalation. The conventions," I said, "were signed by 38 of the 42 species in this room. They were not signed by the Vilhari, who were not a member species when the conventions were drafted. They were not signed by the Kreth Dominion until 60 years after the original document, which is why the territorial clause language favors established powers, and they were not signed by us. I looked at the chamber. This review is about what we did. What I am asking is whether the alternative was better. Not for the process, for the people. The upper left tier, the small delegation, they were very still now. But it was the stillness of attention, not discomfort. Orth said, "You will appreciate that. The Accord cannot endorse unilateral action by non-signatory parties simply because the outcome was favorable. If every non-signatory felt entitled to intervene and formally declared engagements based on their own assessment of the outcome, they would need to care enough to try." I said, "Most don't." "We did." Another murmur. "The Accord stability," I said, "is built on predictability. I understand. That predictability requires rules, and rules require compliance, and compliance is easier when everyone agrees. I understand all of it. What I am asking this chamber to also understand is that stability built on conventions that absorb the disappearance of 200,000 people and call it an acceptable outcome is not a stability I agreed to protect." I stopped. I had said what I came to say. Orth looked at me for a long moment. The chamber was quiet. The translation arrays hummed their continuous neutral sound. "We will recess," Orth said. I was escorted to a waiting area off the main corridor. It was a plain room with 2 chairs and a small table and a window that looked out onto a corridor, and after about 10 minutes an Accord administrative clerk came in, a species I did not recognize. Small, quick-moving, with large eyes. The clerk set down a cup of something hot on the table near me and looked at the door and looked at me. Then, in a voice almost too quiet for my translator to catch, said, "My home world was almost of El Hazard once." Then the clerk walked out. I looked at the cup. I looked at the door. I picked up the cup and held it in both hands and let it warm them. Outside in the corridor, 42 species were deciding what to do about us. I was not worried. I had done what I came to do, and the number was in the chamber now, and numbers like that do not leave rooms. They stay. They change the temperature of things. They make certain arguments harder to say out loud. I had learned that a long time ago, not in space on Earth, in a very different kind of room, arguing about a very different kind of problem. Some problems are the same shape everywhere. I drank the hot drink and waited. The vote was 38-4. I know some people expected me to be angry about it. A few journalists on Earth wrote pieces about the indignity of the ruling, the arrogance of the Accord, the way they had treated us. I read the pieces with mild interest and then put them down. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that, not because I was resigned or defeated or had given up. I was not angry because the vote made complete sense to me, and I had seen it coming since the day I filed the observer request and knew that what we were doing was going to end exactly here. The resolution passed on a Thursday. Humans were formally prohibited from participating in any sanctioned accord, conflict as combatants, advisors, or observers. The Accord framed it as a safety regulation. I read the full text. of the resolution on the transport home. The word they used most often was unpredictable. That word appeared 14 times in a 12-page document I counted. They were afraid that we were unpredictable. They were afraid that we did not follow the form. They were afraid that if humans were allowed into their carefully structured system of managed conflict, the system would stop being manageable. That other species would watch what we did at Orith and begin asking the same questions we had asked, that the conventions would start to feel less like protection and more like offense. They were right. That was the part they could not say out loud. The resolution talked about stability and precedent and interstellar security, but what it was actually saying in the language underneath the language was, you showed everyone that the rules have gaps and now we need you to go away before anyone else notices. I stepped off the transport in Lagos on a gray afternoon in November, and my grandmother, who was 91 years old and had survived 3 different kinds of catastrophe on Earth and was sharper than anyone I had ever met in space, was standing at the edge of the landing pad with a cup of actual real coffee. I walked over to her. She looked at me for a long moment. They banned you, she said. They did, I said. She handed me the coffee. From what? Exactly. From war, I said. She thought about this. And is there less war? I looked at the sky. Not yet, I said. But there will be. She made a sound that was neither agreement nor disagreement, which was her way of saying she was waiting for proof. I gave her the proof. It took 5 years. The first sign came 14 months after the resolution passed. A mid-size territorial dispute between 2 Accord member species in the Eastern Passage, the kind that historically proceeded through the standard engagement framework and resolved in the standard way. Both parties filed their notifications. The Accord scheduled mediation. The engagement date was set. It did not happen. Both parties withdrew their engagement filings within 48 hours of each other, citing what their respective diplomatic notices called change strategic assessment. The Accord recorded it as a successful pre-engagement mediation. It was not a mediation. Our intelligence, which had not been banned because the resolution only covered direct participation, indicated that both parties had separately reached the same conclusion. If we start this engagement and it does not resolve cleanly and one of us or both of us is losing, there is nothing to stop the humans from deciding to observe. They did not want us to observe, so they did not fight. The second case came 8 months after that, a different region, a different dispute, the same outcome. The third came 6 months after the second. 3 scheduled conflicts, 3 non-starts. My former battalion was stationed at Outpost Corvell, technically retired from active operations under the resolution's terms, technically doing nothing more than routine territorial patrol. Just being there. Just being visibly, undeniably there. Uniform with equipment in a part of the galaxy that had just watched what happened at Orith. The resolution had banned us from war. What it had accidentally created was something the Accord did not have a word for and had not planned for and could not regulate because there was nothing in any convention about it. A deterrent that nobody had asked for. That cost nothing to maintain, that worked simply by existing. I was sitting in my house in Lagos, 2 years after the resolution, reading a report that Nora had forwarded from Outpost Corvell when the secure message came through. Not from Earth Command, not from the Accord, from a private channel routed through 3 different relay stations to make it difficult to trace, using a cipher that had been developed specifically for communications that certain parties did not want on record. It was from a small coalition of 7 Accord member species. The message was brief. It asked whether the United Earth Expeditionary Corps would be willing to participate in an informal arrangement, not a combat role, not an advisory role. Both of those were banned, something different, a presence role, a standing agreement that human units would maintain positions at specific locations in specific corridors, specific regions, and would be available in the event of a significant violation of convention protections to exercise their own independent judgment about what kind of observation was required. The message was careful not to use certain words. I read it twice. Then I called Nora. "Have you seen this?" I said. "I drafted the response," she said. I laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind I did not do often, and it surprised me a little. "What did you say?" I asked. "I said we would think about it," she said. "I thought you should actually think about it before we committed." "That was thoughtful of you." "I am very thoughtful," she said. "Have you thought about it?" I looked out the window at the gray November sky. I thought about Owen's question, which I still did not have a fully clean answer to. I thought about the 3 scheduled conflicts that had not happened. I thought about the clerk in the Accord waiting room and the hot drink and the quiet voice. I thought about my grandmother asking if there would be less war. "The resolution banned us from participating," I said. "It did," Nora said. "Being present is not participating." "It is not," she said. "Being present is just being there. And if our being there makes certain parties hesitate, then they hesitated," she said. "We did not do anything. We were just there." I was quiet for a moment. "Tell them yes," I said. Nora was quiet for a moment on her end. "Then I'll send it." Owen Fletcher called me that evening. He was 27 now, still in the Corps, stationed at a relay point near the outer passage. He had heard about the informal arrangement through channels that he was technically not supposed to have access to, but he had always been good at finding things he was technically not supposed to know. "So we're doing the deterrent thing," he said. "We are maintaining a presence," I said. "Right," he said, "the deterrent thing." I heard him smile through the audio. "Does it feel like the right thing?" he asked. It was the same question in a different form, still earnest. He had not lost that. "It feels like the useful thing," I said. "Whether it is the right thing, I think we find out over time." He was quiet. "Do you know what I think about?" "Sometimes," he said, "I think about those 4 settlements, whether they're still there." "They are," I said. "I checked last month. All 4. Population is growing. Actually, there is a school in the largest one now." He did not say anything for a moment. "A school," he said. "A school," I said. Another silence, but a different kind. The kind that fills up with something other than worry. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, okay." I understood him completely. Amara Collins sent me a message 6 months after that. She was working in Accord translation services, which she had taken up after the resolution because she spoke 12 languages and the Accord needed translators, and it turned out that being known as one of the humans from Orith was, in certain circles and in certain quiet ways, not a disadvantage. Her message contained a single attached file. It was an unofficial study, circulated among Accord research departments, not published, not intended for public distribution. It had been written by a research team from one of the neutral species, the ones who had watched the Eastern field engagement on the broadcast and gone home and started asking questions. The study was titled Long-Term Behavioral Modification in Interstellar Conflict Initiation Following the Orith Engagement. It was 47 pages long. I read all 47 pages. The conclusions were careful and qualified in the way that academic work is careful and qualified, full of phrases like preliminary assessment and insufficient longitudinal data and further study required, but underneath the qualifications, the numbers were clear in the regions where human presence had been maintained. Conflict initiation rates had dropped significantly in the regions where human presence had not been maintained. The rates had remained stable. The effect was not from our fighting. We had not fought. We had been present. We had been known. We had been the thing in the back of the calculation that changed the outcome before the question was ever formally asked. The study had a phrase near the end that I read 3 times. It said, "The human deterrence effect appears to operate primarily through anticipatory uncertainty. Parties considering conflict initiation cannot reliably predict what response, if any, human forces would elect to make. This uncertainty appears sufficient in most observed cases to alter the decision. Cannot reliably predict. Unpredictable." That word again, the same word that appeared 14 times in the resolution. The thing they had been afraid of, the thing that had made 38 species vote to remove us from the equation. They had removed us from the equation, and the equation had changed anyway. I put down the study and went to make coffee. Real coffee, the good kind, the kind I had been meaning to make for 3 days and kept delaying because there was always something else to do. I stood in my kitchen and listened to it brew and thought about Orith, about the gray morning and the salt smell, and Essen's exhausted, careful voice, about the Western Grove and 14 people moving through darkness with one hand on the shoulder of the person ahead, about the note Amara had written in Kreth script and left on a supply vehicle that was going nowhere. I thought about what war was and what it could be and what it had been on a single planet across a very long history, and all the ways we had tried to make it stop and all the ways it had refused to, until somehow, eventually, imperfectly, we had found combinations of consequences and deterrence and costs that made it less worth starting. We had not solved it. We had never solved it, not on Earth, not anywhere. But we had learned over a very long time that the goal was not to be impossible to defeat. The goal was to be too complicated to attack without calculating the full cost first. The Accord had looked at us and seen a threat, a wild variable, something that disrupted the orderly management of conflict. They were right. But a wild variable in a system of managed violence is not necessarily the problem. Sometimes the wild variable is the thing that makes the system honest. The thing that reminds everyone paying attention that the rules exist to protect people, not to protect the rules. The coffee finished, I poured a cup. I sat down. I thought about Owen's question one more time, are we the good guys? I thought about the school in the southern settlement. I thought about 3 wars that did not start. I thought about the clerk in the waiting room and the hot drink and the words that had been almost too quiet to hear. I thought about 47 pages of a study that no one was supposed to read, concluding in careful academic language that our presence was changing the math. I did not have a clean answer to Owen's question. I had decided some time ago that clean answers to that question were a luxury that the Valhari could not afford and that I therefore would not pretend to. What I had instead was a cup of good coffee and a phone that I could pick up and call my grandmother and tell her that yes, there was going to be less war, not because we had been good, but because we had been present and unpredictable and impossible to fully account for. She would say that was not the same thing. She would be right. But she would also, I thought, consider it a reasonable start. The resolution held, it holds still. Humans are formally, officially on the record banned from participating in any sanctioned galactic accord conflict in any capacity. The ban is still cited in accord legal proceedings as one of the most significant regulatory actions in modern interstellar history. I consider it a victory condition. Not because we wanted to be banned, not because we were trying to frighten anyone, but because a ban is acknowledgement. It is a declaration by 30 species that we were too much of a factor to be allowed inside the system, that our presence changed outcomes, that the thing they had built, the managed, structured, convention-governed business of interstellar conflict, did not work the same way when we were near it. They banned us from war. What they did not anticipate was that we had already been doing the same thing to ourselves for a very long time. Not successfully, not completely, not without enormous cost and failure and grief, but trying, always trying, finding the deterrents and the tripwires and the costs that made the calculation harder. We knew how the story ended because we had lived it over and over on a single world, and we had the scars to prove it. And we had come out the other side with a set of instincts about conflict that no species which had never fought quite like us would ever fully understand. We were banned from war. Every species in this galaxy sleeps a little easier knowing that somewhere in the outer passage, in the eastern corridors, in the quiet distances between stars, there are humans who could enter the equation and who chose for now to stand at the edge of it instead. We call that a Tuesday. We have a lot of Tuesdays. We are not done.